Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Our question is how to write a good paper, and this is, I guess, a good chunk of what many of you, if you continue with research careers, will do, and even, I hope, during your PhDs. But it's not a subject on which anybody has a monopoly on truth, right? There's no one right way to do this. So rather than me just rant for an hour and you sit there like stuffed cabbages, it would be more fun if you would make comments or ask questions as we go along, all right? So kind of make me feel that you're alive and here. After all, there you are, the cream of the world is sitting in this room. So don't disappoint me. So 7 suggestions about writing papers. I'd like to just offer you kind of 7 clues for how to go about it that have worked for me. So the first thing is, don't wait, right? There's always the feeling you should do research like this. First of all, you have a great idea, and then you work on it for ages, like when you're working on your PhD, and then you write the paper and declare victory. Right? That seems logical, doesn't it? Very bad plan, right? Here is a much better plan, right? So you have a kind of idea, perhaps not a very significant or interesting one, and then you start writing the paper. And as you start writing the paper, it forces you to kind of crystallize the idea, and then you realize which bits you don't understand, so you know what work to do. If you like, it's like, I'm a functional programmer, I like lazy evaluation. It's like a forcing function that forces you to evaluate the necessary bits of your work, right? It's not uncommon to, even when you've done quite a lot of work, to start to write the paper and realize there's a whole section that you haven't even started that's essential to the paper, right? So writing early is really important. Another reason why it's important is it lets you talk about it with other people. Right? Because if you want to have a dialogue with somebody else, if it's a sort of vague mishmash of stuff in your head, it's hard to have that conversation. As soon as you crystallize it on paper, you give them something concrete to anchor themselves on. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people after they first produced the draft. That gives me so much more to substance to say, oh, but what about this and this? We have a completely different kind of conversation than we had when they were just generally telling me about what they were doing. Okay, so the kind of idea I want to get across to you is that writing papers is not just a way of reporting the research you have already done, it's the way you do research. Does that make sense? I think this is a big shift of perspective for me. It took me a while to absorb this, so I'm giving you this for free right now. This is the way you do research, is by starting to write the paper, and then it forces you to figure out what's going on. Okay, that's number 1. So far, so good? Number 2, don't try to identify what your idea is. So I started here by saying, look, here, have an idea, do some research, but you must know in the end what it is. Because what's the purpose of your paper? You might think it's to sort of, get brownie points or something on your publication record, but the real reason of your paper is to act like a virus. Right. What's your name? Alexander, right? So if I write a paper, part of my goal is to get an idea out of my head and make it infect Alexander's brain so that he is unable to think about anything else. It monopolizes all his thoughts, and then he tells other people, and soon I've dominated the world. So it's like a kind of infection. That's perhaps a bit of a self-indulgent way of thinking of writing a paper, but it's a good metaphor for the thing you wanted to convey is not a system or an artifact, it's an idea. And it's an idea that's not just interesting to me. The way that you'll communicate it to other people is because it's interesting to them. That is, it's a reusable idea. It's an idea that they might use in their setting. So how do I solve simultaneous linear equations? Once you've conveyed that idea, somebody else might see that they could use it in their context. Does that make sense? And
yeah, I just wanted to comment as well that just Jack Lang also made that point how important it is when you want to start your own business to kind of really think of where you're going. What do you want to achieve? Do you want to earn money? Do you want to heal the world? So same here, really.
Right. Yeah, but you have to be a little danger here. Once we get into healing the world, right? You don't want to be too ambitious about your idea because otherwise you never start writing. You'd think, oh, I'm kind of stuck at phase 1 here. right? I haven't even got idea, so I want to come back to that in a second. But just think about Mozart for a second, right? He is a guy who did this amazingly, right? Hundreds of years after he died, we still go to concert halls to listen to people read his papers. Isn't that amazing? His ideas were so persuasive, and it's pure thought stuff, really, that he's conveying to us. Of course, the musicians are doing wonderful things as well, but this idea conveying is the important bit about what a paper is. And when you read a paper, I think you always read it thinking, how could this be useful to me? What's the clever insight that I could apply in my work? Does that make sense? You're not really reading it to think how wonderfully clever the author is. Oh, I worship at his feet. No, you're thinking, what could I learn from this, right? And of course, the bit at the bottom is important too, right? Even if you're Einstein, if you sit in a small dark room and think, but never communicate, what use are you to the world? You might as well never have been born, from a research point of view, right? Right? So you've got to communicate, otherwise your ideas, no matter how fantastic, are just sort of kept to yourself. Now, okay, so that's why conveying ideas is important. Now, so when you write a paper, you need to know, in the end, what the idea is. When you read a paper, you will be thinking, implicitly or explicitly, what is the idea that I'm learning here? When you're writing a paper, it's important to have that same question in your mind. It may be hard to know to begin with, but you really do need to know by the time you've finished. Right? And so you need to be able to say, what is the idea of the paper? And if you have lots of ideas, so sometimes you read a paper and it goes, thing. There's a kind of journey that you go on, which goes through a number of ideas, none of which are discussed in very much detail. And you get the feeling that the author was packing so much in that he sort of took something this long and compressed it to this long. So now it's like kind of highly concentrated fudge, very difficult to digest, and perhaps hard to understand because it's not explained in enough detail. So if you have lots of ideas, just write lots of papers, right? What's bad about that, right? More publications, that's good too.
Just one comment from me. So by the time when I did my PhD, which is a while ago, and it was back then that you couldn't download papers from the internet, you would go to the library. So I had perhaps 4 or 5 papers a week to go through. I mean, nowadays with all that information that is at your hand so easily, you may have 50 papers in a week. So is there kind of, has paper writing changed in the way how you pick up that idea so quickly if you only have a few minutes or so to scan it?
I don't know, I'm thinking here principally about authorship, right? So, and I don't have ideas any faster because of the internet, sadly. Right? So the rate limiting step is how many good ideas you have and how long it takes you to express them in a clear and articulate way. I'm also
thinking of the consumer to kind of grasp the main idea of the paper. If you have 50 or so of those to go through in a week, how you can sort of...
I'm thinking about writing papers here, not reading them. So I'm not offering any advice about how to read 50 papers quickly. Okay. But I'd like you to write your one paper so well that a reader has a very clear idea of what a very clear understanding of what your idea is, right? That will mean that they can read your paper more quickly and they'll enjoy it more too. Okay? Now, nobody here, apart from Scarlett, has asked a question or made a comment of any kind. So, I'm going to have a little. Let's see. Just let me before we give that opportunity, just remark that if you're going to have an idea in a paper, at the end you must know what it is, and once you know what it is, you must tell your reader. I've written many reviews in which early in the review I say, I believe that the main idea of the paper is blah blah blah, but I'm not quite sure, and I wish the author had said so. So try writing early in your paper a sentence like, the main idea of this paper is, and then complete that sentence. And if you can't, start to worry a little bit about your paper. All right? Or sometimes there's a section in which, after an introduction and a little bit of background, you say, all right, payload is coming. Papers often don't distinguish between when they move off background and start to move on to new material. So you want to very clearly signpost, this is the payload. The idea is coming. Wake up here. You see what? And don't leave the reader to guess this. It's not the referee's business to guess where the payload is. You've got to put big signposts to it. Okay? All right. Questions, comments?
published a paper already.
No. No? Well, I'll give you one more chance. I'll go on a little bit, but you've got to think about your own writing experiences, and I'm sure you have some thoughts you might want to reflect about that to everybody else in the room. This is perhaps a relevant slide, right? Because a room like this is perhaps slightly intimidating, and certainly it's often intimidating when you're thinking about writing papers. You think, oh, there's the big wide world out there, and my idea is so, humiliatingly trivial that nobody will be interested in it, right? So you read everybody else's papers, and they have amazing ideas, right? And, oh, I'm a mere worm, and nobody will be interested to read my little trivial idea, right? But the truth is that is really quite different, that once you start writing about an idea, even one that seems quite trivial, computer science is the kind of subject that kind of ramifies, right? You start with a simple trivial idea, and it turns out to be much more interesting than you had at first supposed. Just occasionally, you start writing about a trivial idea, and it turns out to be trivial, right? But that's a very quick paper to write, so there's not much lost. But much more common is you start writing about a simple, humble thing, and it turns out to be interesting. Okay? So just that's my experience at any rate. So do not be intimidated. Just start to write. And indeed, starting to write is, you kind of, until you start to write, you don't really know with any clarity what your idea is, unless your person works completely differently to me. Okay? All right. Next thing. So now you have at least a proto-idea, some idea about how you want to start writing your paper. Now, what are you going to put in the paper? So there's a lot of things that people put in the papers that don't belong there, and some stuff they miss out that should be there. So here's one way of thinking about it. Try to think of writing your paper as just telling a story. Imagine that you were speaking to somebody with a whiteboard. What would you do? Right, how would you explain the story? You'd somehow you tell a story, something like this, you try to explain what the problem is you're trying to solve, and you try to give, briefly, some motivation for why it's an interesting problem to want to solve, right? Because you're trying to motivate them to stay with you to hear the rest of what you have to say. Then you're going to kind of present what the idea is, and then you're going to put maybe in a sort of sketchy kind of way, and then perhaps fill in some more details about how it works, okay? So your goal is to try to get your reader hooked at the early part by thinking, actually, if this paper could solve that problem, that would be pretty cool. I'd like to know how to solve that problem. And then after a little bit, you want them to think, that's quite a clever solution. I wish I'd thought of that. Right? Or I'm following that. I wonder how the details work out. So here's a picture of what papers, my as it were, default outline for a paper. And I've added here the kind of number of readers that you might expect to get for each bit of this outline. So a lot of people will read the title, a few people will read the abstract and the first page, and after that, things fall off very fast. Right? What does that tell you about the amount of effort you should invest in page one? Right? Page one is like your kind of, the sugar fix. You want to get them hooked on page one. So do not waste page one with lots of background stuff that's very boring about related work. You want to get them hooked very quickly. So, so this is my. I want to say a little bit more about each of these chunks now. So, in particular, firstly, I want to say a little bit about the abstract and introduction. So I'm just going to deal with abstract quickly. Well, no, I'm going to talk about introduction, then abstract. Introduction, very important, page one, and try to fit it on one page. So in the kind of ACM-style conference format, you know that dense two-column format? One page ought to be enough. For the sort of journal, smaller, folio size pages, one page is never enough because half of it is the title, and then you only get 10 lines. So you can't fit the introduction on page one. But logically, think about an introduction that would be short enough to fit on the page one of an A4 conference-style format. That's a good length for an abstract. And what do you want to do in your introduction? Firstly, say what the problem you're trying to solve is. Secondly, say what your contributions are. Okay, so those two things. What is the problem? So here's an example from a paper I wrote a while ago. And so I'm trying to state, pretty briefly, it takes me 3 paragraphs here, what the problem is. And you notice that I've done so here by using a concrete example. So don't try to state the problem in its full generality. Give an example that illustrates the problem that a reader can grab a hold of and think, I can see the kind of problem you're thinking about. Then you may generalize a little bit. So did I generalize a little bit this here? No, at this point I haven't generalized at all, in fact. But so give an example early on, and then generalize a bit to state the sort of scope of the problem that you're trying to solve. And do it as concretely as you can. And try not to overclaim. Try not to overstate. So I've called this molehills, not mountains, because people sometimes say, in this paper we address the challenge of writing correct programs. Does this make your blood pump round your body, your heart beat faster? And does it make you think, yes, this is the paper I want to read? No, it doesn't, because writing correct programs is something that thousands of computer scientists have been addressing for tens of years, right? So it's not a problem that's going to be solved by this paper. So if you describe too ambitious a goal, you make it clear that you're not going to solve that goal in this paper, so you're giving the reader no motivation for reading. That make sense? So you want to define a soluble goal. So here's an example. Consider this program which has an interesting bug, and there, rather as I did here, you give an example of the interesting bug, right? We're going to show an automatic technique for removing this kind of bug, and then you might want to say a bit more about what kind of bug it is. Yeah. At last. Thank you.
Well, sometimes I think it's good to start from general things, because you let the reader know where in the domain you are talking about. I mean, for example, if you are talking about a particular verification approach, so if you talk about, and you are submitting to a general conference, for example, it's good if you say, verification is good, for this reason, and then you say, oh, well, but verification in this case doesn't work. And then you say, I'm going to do this. But maybe sometimes the very, yawning things come handy.
Well, so that's a good question. What do the rest of you think? Remember this page 1, right, is the one where you have all your readers still with you. Is it worth spending a paragraph saying verification is good? Yeah.
Maybe not a paragraph, but at least 2 sentences to give a perspective on how important a problem is.
How important verification is?
I mean, sure, but if you're sure, if someone from that background is reading it, they know the problem and they know how important it is. Supposing someone somewhat relevant but not exactly in the field reads the paper, he'll be like, why are they doing this? Is it important?
All right. So it's a judgment call. It's a judgment call. But if I'm writing for a programming languages conference, say, I wouldn't waste the sentence saying verification is important. If I was writing for a conference that covered the whole of computer science, I might, but I never do, right? Because that paper is probably too specialized then. So I don't know. I would err on the side of being more specific myself.
Maybe if the paper is published, maybe later someone download the paper and just get lost with the very, very detailed sentence in the introduction.
I mean, I think the basic assumption is that you're assuming probably that very domain-specific audiences are the only ones benefiting from it. And sometimes, like I read some biology papers because, I want to know about something that's not exactly relevant, but if they don't give me perspective, I'll probably have some trouble getting hold of it.
Right, so there is a judgment call here. I think my sense is that most papers err on the side of too much generality and then lose their readers too early, rather than erring on the side of too much detail. And when I say generality, I do also mean things like, suppose let D be an epimorphic bifunctor over a codomain, that kind of generality, where you state a very general problem in very technical language, right? That's a different kind of being specialized, but it's not good either. So examples are good, yeah.
So I heard some statistic recently that the average number of people that reads a paper in the sciences, an academic paper in the sciences, is something like 0.3.
Right.
That's not including the author or the authors, so
right.
In addition to the authors. And with the humanities, it's something like 0.5. So I think if people consider that, I think it could. I mean, you're not often even going to get this 1,000 people reading the abstract. So if you consider that, I think it can help focus your mind a bit. I know it's also a bit cynical, and you might just quit, but you might think, well, like I need to try and get that number up a little bit.
You can be the author. This 0.3, that 0.3 does sound very low, actually, as an average number of readers across all of science. But nevertheless, as an author, you can get your average a lot higher, right? And this might be part of how. Yeah. So just think about that page one. Never mind the sort of details. I'm making some suggestions here. But in particular, if you think about the page one, this is where I want to get my readers hooked. That's very important. Rather than saying, I've got a hooked reader who's committed to read the whole paper, what should I tell him first? Do you see the difference between those two attitudes? Think about the format. Okay, good. You're awake, excellent. Let's see. All right, I'm now happy, yes. Now, we talked about describing the problem. The next thing that I think you want to do in the introductions is say what your contributions are. It's extraordinary how many papers do not say this. Quite a lot of papers in their introductions say the contributions to this paper, this, this, and this, but a surprisingly large proportion do not. Instead, they rely on the author, the reader, or the referee to figure it out. What a stupid thing to do. You know what your contributions are, articulate them. Here's an example. I almost always do this by using bullets. So I have a kind of introductory section that introduces the problem, and then I go on a bit, blah, blah, blah. I think this was the same paper, actually. And then I say, in this paper, I usually say, we make the following contributions. Here, I just sort of said more general sentence. We put the choice on a firmer basis. And then bullet, bullet, bullet. So a bullet for each contribution, right? So you leave the reader in no doubt about what you believe the contributions of this paper are. That is, the new bit, the payload of the paper. Right? If you leave your reader in doubt, you have a problem. You certainly have a problem with referees, and you probably have a problem with readers, because what you want them to do, this is like the specification of the problem, right? So we got, and did I say something about evidence? Yes. So the introduction, these bullets make claims, right? So what's the claim here? The choice of evaluation of effect in subtle but pervasive ways, identify and discuss these effects in 5 and 6 contrast. So I'm making some claims, and then I'm doing, I'm using forward references to point to evidence that supports the claim. So as you go through your claims in the contribution, they should be refutable claims, point to the evidence that supports it. Does that make sense? So think of it as a specification, and the rest of the paper is the implementation, to put it in programming languages terms, and try to make the specification refutable, right? If you say, contribution, we will study the properties of system X. Well, that's not refutable. Of course you'll study it in some level, right? Nobody could read the paper and say, actually, they said they'd study it, and they didn't study it, right? They talked about their holidays, right? You probably will say something about the system, and it could count as studying. So you want to make sure that the contributions bit, if you can, contains refutable claims. That is, things that could possibly be false. Right? Think of it like celery, that is, something with some crunch, rather than overcooked spaghetti. All right? And then read other papers with that in mind. As you read a paper, think, does this author make refutable claims? And if not, then you could look for the refutable claims that they make. All right? Yeah.
It's also useful if you model your paper like this, then it's also useful for people reading it, kind of looking for relevant literature to what they're on their problem, right? So what I usually do, I kind of read the title, the abstract, and then I look for that our contribution bit. To just read through it and quickly.
That's right.
And it's also very important to have a related work on that sense, because if your related, what you're doing is not relevant to what I'm looking for, then maybe in the related work I could find something good. Right. So it's really important also from the reader's perspective to have something like that.
Yes, and it's easier to find if it's laid out in a very clear way rather than just dense text, I think. You can sort of lay it out one at a time. Okay, yeah.
But how much should I say about my contributions? Because I was reading recently a paper about like ownership types, and there was a whole this column in IE style of contributions, and I kind of got lost in them.
So how much should you say? Well, so this is another judgment call, right? I think you, so maybe you're describing something in which the author went on to say, here, what did I say? I put a sort of little paragraph about each of these. If you go on to write a lot about each of them, you find that you don't have the notational scaffolding, the mental terminology for the reader to understand much detail at this point. So you have to find a way to state your contributions that's quite compact, right? But in a way but each with a forward reference. So if you say, this doesn't have, if you have technical terms like the eval-apply model seems decisively superior, you'd like to say, I wonder what that means. Oh, section 5. See what I mean? So anything, so you compress, but you make it clear that you're not really expected to understand everything here, unless you're an expert already, maybe, right? If you're just interested as a reader, you'll find more later. It's not easy to write the list of contributions. Another thing you can find from your list of contributions is you're forward referencing to section 5, 6, or 5, 7, and 8, but there's no forward reference to section 6. That's weird. Is section 6 not contributing anything to your paper then? So it's a kind of dead code elimination algorithm, right, that if any section is unreferenced here, you might think, could I leave it out? Or alternatively, maybe there's a contribution this paper makes that I ought to put in the introduction. This isn't a hard and fast rule, it's just a little clue to look. I often have sections that in my paper that are not referenced here, but I always know why they're there still. Okay? Yeah?
Can you say nitty-gritty in a paper?
Can you say what?
Because on the previous slide.
Oh, nitty-gritty. Oh, yes. So this is, I'm using informal language here, aren't I? What? So nitty-gritty detail.
Nice, but can you do it? I mean, is it something that's...
Absolutely. This is a published paper. Yes. So I urge you to use vivid language. Sometimes, if you're too vivid and too informal, it may grate a little on your referees, and they may complain. They'll seldom reject it for that sole reason. But it's way more fun to read, and use the active voice. Don't say, it has been thought that, blah, blah, blah. You say, we think that, and so use active voice a lot.
That is kind of a problem actually, because so when I tried to publish a paper, one of the comments from the reviewers was that I was using the active we and I, and that everything should be in passive voice, and I did not really agree, but this is the kind of thing that...
So I think that doesn't happen very often in my experience, at least in computer science. It obviously did happen to you, but I think the referees who simply believe that every academic paper should be written in the passive voice are very few and far between. You must have just hit one of them. And if you have to get past them, maybe you have to switch to the passive voice for that paper. But I would urge you not to do that in general. Because it's much more boring to read, isn't it? Oh, makes you lose the will to live. Yeah?
Do you agree that using informal language is a bit of a risky game to play for a non-native speaker? So I'm reading some papers that are clearly written by non-native speakers, and an error along those lines is somehow more annoying than an error along the lines of, they just got some preposition wrong, because in that case, it's fine, but I don't know, I feel like sometimes it's a bit over the top when someone's trying out bits of English, but they're not, and that sounds horribly like superior from a native English speaker, but I don't mean it like that, I just mean it reads to me like in, so anyway, I
think us, English speakers, native English speakers, are awed and respectful of the amazing way in which non-native English speakers manage to write their papers. It's hard enough writing a computer science paper in your own language, let alone writing in some other language. So all you non-native English speakers, you are amazing, right? But you should seek help from native speakers occasionally just to proofread your paper, to check for idioms, the kind of thing you're describing here. And I suppose maybe you're right that you don't want to go too far on the informal language, perhaps if you're not very confident of the idiom. But check out with the native speaker too. Oh, the referees may not be native speakers, yes, but then they will seldom say, I suppose, I don't know. I've never had a referee who sort of criticised linguistic forms, who wasn't pretty confident of the language. I'm not sure that's really too much of a problem. So I guess all I'm saying here is I would err on the side of informality if you're, when you're making a choice. But obviously none of these things are, extremes. That just on the whole, I think papers are typically too formal rather than too informal. Yeah.
Do you
think like this section should also include those paragraphs that you often find in papers, like this paper is organized in the following way?
No, no, no. Do not do this.
Okay, yeah.
Oh.
I find those really boring.
It's hopeless, that's right. You look at the paper and you get to this paragraph on page 1, right, that precious gold dust page 1, and do you read this with excitement? Do you think, yes, this is the paragraph I want to read. I'm so glad it's finally come. It's like chocolate, you know, the reward at the end of the introduction. You skip it, don't you? Because you're going to read the paper, or else you're not. But this isn't going to change what you do. In fact, if you've done a good job with your forward references here, right, all this stuff, you have essentially said this because you've already pointed forward to the sections in the paper that go. So just don't do this at all, right? Just use the contributions to do that. It's a complete waste of time. I don't know why everybody does it. It's amazingly common. Yeah. Completely useless. Thank you for pointing that out. Now, I want to say a bit about related work, because you mentioned this, somebody mentioned related work earlier. Right. So what usually happens with papers is this. Well, I say usually, often. You read sort of introduction, you think this sounds interesting, and then here's you, the reader, right, sort of walking up to the paper. And then you get to this sort of section 2 that says related work, or background or something. And it has language like this. Right, so it's a sort of a walk through the literature, using terminology that you do not understand, citing papers that you do not know about, right? And it makes you, it's bad in 2 different ways. The first is, it makes you feel stupid as a reader, because you read this introduction, read this background and related work section, and you don't understand any of it. So you think, I must be an idiot. And also, because it's long, well, you know, maybe a page, perhaps sometimes 2 pages, right? You think, I'm just exhausted. I'm not sure I'm going to make it through this to get to the payload, right? And yet, you don't feel you can stop reading it in case this material is essential to what will follow. You see the problem? Have you ever felt this when you're reading a paper? You know, that sense of feeling stupid? Is this what you would do to, yeah, we all know that feeling, don't we? Is that what you would do to your friend on the whiteboard? You know, you've got Alexander in the room, and he's, you know, giving you the pleasure of his company, and you're standing in front of the whiteboard. Would you say, Alexander, look, we're going to adopt the notion of transaction from Brown, and use the 4-phase interpolation algorithm, none of which Alexander has ever heard of? Right? You wouldn't. You would skip all of that, wouldn't you? You would skip to your idea. And you might mention when you were introducing your idea, you would say, oh, by the way, this particular part of the idea, that isn't you, right? That was this Brown guy. I'll tell you a bit more about him later. So it's not that you want to, it's not that you want to ignore related work, it's just that you want to tell your story, and as you tell it, you make incidental references to other people, and then you put the related work part kind of at the end here. So instead of putting it at the beginning, I always put the related work section at the end. By the end, you have a lot more, you've got much more intellectual scaffolding. You have had another 6 pages to introduce your reader to the terminology and to the kind of problems that you have, and also you've introduced your idea. So by the time you get to related work, you're in a position to say, here's what Brown did that was very relevant and we built on that, and, but here's how my idea differs. Right? It was until you presented your idea, it's very difficult to say how it differs. See the point? Yeah.
So I've seen a few instances of this where clearly someone's been to your talk, or maybe just knows to put related work at the end. But then it's just very much a summary of related work, which I've found to be completely... So I felt through reading through the description of the problem and how it was solved, I'd already kind of managed to infer a bit what related work might have been. Mm-hmm. And the last thing I wanted to do, what appeared to be the end of the paper, was then read a summary of related work, because it felt like it's just like somebody summarizing the field at the end. So I think maybe what would be important, I would take away from this, is what's important is it needs to be a critical comparison of your method with the other methods, rather than just a literature review at the end of the paper, which seems...
Right, so I think that saying the word critical comparison is very good, right? Because what you don't want is to just, what you often get in related work sections is, I think what you're referring to as a summary is where you say, you know, Brown and White did this in 1960 and they used these kind of transactions. And then you say, then there's another sentence about the next one, another sentence about the next one, giving no comparison either with each other or with your work. right? And so I think you're completely right that what you want is, because at this stage in the paper it's possible to do it, to give a critical comparison. They're better on this axis, they're perhaps not quite so good on that axis. Thanks, it's a very good point. And you can't do that at the beginning. The bit that an early related work section does let you do, and which of course, related work sections that occur early sometimes do this very well, is they introduce the problem and sort of build up a series of ideas that culminate in the problem and your idea, right? That can work well, but if you think of that as the primary mission is to get to a statement of the problem and your idea, right? To do that, you may well need to build up from a series of failed iterations or earlier ideas, and in doing so, you may want to cite earlier work. But the purpose is to get to the point where the reader understands your idea, not to describe related work. It merely cites related work as appropriate on that journey. So that, because what you don't want is for a referee to think, that's Brown and White's idea, isn't it? You appear completely ignorant of that. Right? You don't want that to happen. So you want to say, footnote or citation, just cite freely, just don't digress. Okay? Yeah.
Sometimes the related work section also contains information you need to understand, like mathematical formulas or something.
Right.
That I need to understand what the problem description of the paper is.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
Because sometimes when I only search for what's the point of the paper, I start reading the introduction, and then comes the related work. Then I skip the related work.
Yeah. Then you find you have to come back.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Go to the main problem, and then I'm completely lost at the main problem because I don't understand the things that were explained in the related work section.
So my point is not that you jump immediately to a statement of the problem that is incomprehensible. You do what you would do on a whiteboard, which is to explain enough to understand the problem and the idea. That may involve introducing mathematical notation, right? As you do so, you will cite the source of that notation. That's all. But the purpose is to help the reader to your idea, not to explain everything about the related work. So, somebody else was just behind you,
I think that if you need a certain mathematical idea in your paper, and that idea comes from someone else, then I think you should actually put, not just give a citation, but actually describe it. I mean, if your paper cannot stand on its own, it must kind of heavily rely on somebody's work, which is fine, then at the very least it should be kind of a self-contained unit. You cannot kind of, unless you, obviously you need to assume some prior knowledge on the part of the reader, but you need to kind of think, who are you writing this paper for? I don't know, whatever, somebody from the AI community, and then kind of go from there. I don't know.
Yeah, so rather than so your citations needn't be too, subtle. So you might want to say, if you're introducing some notation, you might say, following Randolph, 1998, we define an epimorphism to be this, right? So in the text, it's clear that you're giving credit to the right person.
You didn't come up with the notation.
Exactly.
But you are using something that's well known in the literature, or something from there.
Yeah, you just state that. That's right. Yeah.
But just maybe a bit philosophical question. Is related work just to show that you know the domain?
Oh, is the related work just to show that you know the domain? No, of course not, right? Nobody's really interested in what you know or don't know, right? Because that's a very sort of self-centered view of it. Why should anybody care about what I know, right? Why? So what's the purpose of the related work section in my paper? Well, after we've, my paper's trying to introduce this idea, so I have to help you to the idea. But then, at least by the time I get to the end, I want to show you how this idea relates to other ideas in the field, right? Because it's a big, complicated world, right? So you want to locate this particular piece of work in the grand scheme of things. Right? And that's something that readers want to know. It's just that if you present too much of that too early, it's very indigestible. Let me say something about credit, though, because here's another fallacy about the related work section, is that to make your work look good, you have to make other people's work look bad, right? So in your related work section, you say, Randolph and co. did X, but it was completely hopeless. It really didn't work at all, and my idea was way better, right? They're a bunch of idiots. Right, you don't actually say that, but that's the implication. Right, so that somehow I can only look great if I make you look stupid. But the good news is that credit is like love, not like money. So if I have £20 and I give, what's your name? Artem. And I give Artem £10, how much do I have left? £10, right? Money is not fungible. If I give Artem some, I don't have it myself. But if I have credit, right, if I give Artem credit in my paper, so in Artem's inspiring earlier work, does that mean that my paper looks less credit-worthy? No, it's like love. You know, if I give love to somebody, there's more love in the world. It's not like a fixed-sized commodity that only comes in sort of units of 20s, right, and get divided. So, and credit is just like that. So take care to warmly acknowledge the people on whose work you build. Use adjectives. They don't take up very much space, but use adjectives like inspiring or helpful or insightful when describing other people's work. If they were, of course. This isn't sort of just fawning on them or trying to make your referees like you. It's because you did find their work inspiring or insightful. But take a moment to say that. It'll make them feel good. And it might even be true. And the other thing is, when you're comparing with related work, this is the critical comparison you were referring to, do not try to give the impression that your work is better on every dimension. You know, we're better, we're faster, we're smaller, we use less memory, you know, it's easier to read, the code is simpler, everything is better. It's most unlikely to be true. Just occasionally, if you're very, very brilliant, it might be true, but it's often not true. And the not true bits are often the bits that people leave out, right? So they leave it for the referee to say, well, it is faster, but it takes 10 to the 12 bytes to compute in, whereas this other guy only takes 10 to the 4 bytes, and that's a big difference. You do not want your referees to be pointing out the weaknesses of your approach. It's rather disarming to a referee if you point it out. Okay? So be honest. It's good from a scientific point of view, and it's actually good from a reviewing point of view if you point out your own weaknesses rather than have somebody else point them out for you. Okay? Yeah.
Being that the introduction is the most read part, you acknowledge your weaknesses in the introduction?
Oh no, I would probably in the introduction I'd probably mainly focus on contributions. You know, what you feel the new things. Maybe I'd have a very sort of brief summary. I do programming language stuff, so I might summarize sort of one or two numbers about performance results and say, you know, those are given in more detail in a later section. And usually I don't say anything very much in the introduction about related work. I just say there's a great deal of related work here which we discussed in section 8, something like that. So introduction has to be short. Judgment always, I know. But and if there's a major and obvious weakness, you know, you're better on X, but really worse on Y, you might want to acknowledge it up front. Yeah.
Maybe that's about the results, right? But, but what about your approach? Like your approach may not always be very general, and you know, people often think, you know, they'll form a judgment on they're having wearable systems. You're expecting a person to wear it, and the sensor has to be on the person. So maybe no one will use it, and the author never makes any claim of, you know, that right. Might be a fallacy.
So you might want to say something in your introduction like, although other systems are more general, in the particular domain where we apply, we think our results are very good, as we shall see in section. So, you know, a little remark like that makes it clear you know you haven't conquered every problem. That's always a good feeling. Yeah.
Always put a positive spin on it, right?
Yeah,
so you can
exactly.
just say it like in the conclusion. Yeah, I mean, this doesn't do that, but you know,
at least it does this well. Yes, put a positive spin on it. Right? You can put a. There is a certain element of a sales job in a paper. I mean, after all, in describing you just don't want it to be, you know, a persuasive argument rather than a snow job in which you're trying to mislead your reader. But you can be positive. Yes.
Actually, that's why one of my colleagues always start from conclusions.
We start from the conclusion. So I never write conclusions. I just stop. I have conclusions in further work, and it's mostly further work, just as a matter of interest. Because I think the contributions part is the bit that drives the rest of the paper. How are we doing? 10-2, that's good. Right. So that's enough about content, really. I want to say a little bit about just the process of writing the paper. And the main thing I want to talk here about is just about about thinking about your readers when you're writing the paper. So for the main payload, which I'm not going to say very much about, is just try to think about how your readers are going to read it. And this is to do with generality here. If you start off the main payload with the most general statement of your theorem, or whatever it is, you're going to put them all to sleep, right? And they'll feel stupid. Do you want your readers to feel stupid? No. Right? You do not. So try not to make them feel stupid. So at the whiteboard, what you do, invariably you start with an example on a whiteboard, don't you? Almost invariably you start with an example or a diagram or something that will get your reader interested. So just use examples as your introductory bit. So here's an example from a paper that I wrote a little while ago. Just this is early on in the paper. I give a couple of concrete examples of the kind of thing I'm trying to deal with. The other thing about examples is that sometimes in your path to this paper, you have been through a lot of examples, right? You have been through a lot of dead ends. Does your research ever have dead ends in it? My research consists almost entirely of dead ends, right? It's like a kind of maze following algorithm, right? And it's tempting when you write a paper to drag your reader into every dead end with you, right? Because there's your blood is soaking the ground, and you want to show them, look, blood is here. That was a very obvious thing, and I did it wrong, and you can do it wrong too. And it can be very annoying for a reader if they've slogged through 2 pages of material that they found it hard going and has consumed their most precious resource, namely their time, and then you tell them, actually, that didn't work. We're going to do something entirely different. Oh, you think, give me a break, right? I could have saved that half hour, right? So don't drag your reader through your journey of discovery. Sometimes there's a dead end that is so obvious that if you lead directly to the conclusion, your reader will be thinking, go there. And why are you taking this very complicated path when there's something so much simpler is available? And then you perhaps have to say, actually, guys, it looks simple, but it didn't work, and here's why. But do try to avoid the taking them down every dead end. Concentrate on the idea that you get to, the shortest path. And so this was about trying to think about your readers, right, and taking them by the shortest path that will get them where they want. And the other thing, that's about you talking to them. But the other thing is about them talking to you. Right, so one advantage of having written a paper down is that you get some feedback on your paper. So how do you get feedback? One thing is, just give your paper to some guinea pigs, that is, friendly people who will read it for you. And when they read it, if you give your paper to, what's your name? Ben. Right, so I give my paper to Ben and say, Ben, do you think you could just read this paper and tell me what you think? And the result, Ben will come back to me with a great number of grammatical suggestions. Right, he will say, this sentence doesn't read very well, and I think you should use a different adjective there, and I'd put a comma there. That's what readers do if you don't educate them otherwise. But if I say, Ben, do me a favor, read this paper and tell me the first place that you get lost. And then stop when I'd like to talk about it. You see the difference? Right, then that focuses Ben's attention not on the details of the grammar, but actually understanding the paper. And then he could say, well, actually, it was somewhere on page 3, I lost touch with the argument, right? And then you could say, then you go to the whiteboard and you say, what I meant was this. And Ben says, why didn't you write that down? And you say, smack forward, I should have. See the dialogue, right? And then you iterate that process about 100 times. But so you need to use your guinea pigs with care, right? Because like guinea pigs in a laboratory, once you've inoculated them with the drug, right, then they're kind of used up, and they can no longer read your paper for the first time. So after I've used up Ben, I have to move on to Thomas, right? So then Thomas is my next guinea pig. So if you use all your guinea pigs at once, then you don't get to show them the successive drafts, because after I've revised it, Ben won't have the same difficulties as he would the first time. Okay? Very important. So these are your friends, right? It's also possible sometimes to get some help from actual experts. Oh, by the way, your friends do not need to be thoroughly expert in this area, right? If they're kind of like English graduates, they're your girlfriend or your boyfriend or something, then they may give you some help, but it won't be the kind of help that I'm describing about where you get lost, probably. You need to find some computer science friends. Right. But they don't need to be expert in the particular narrow subdomain. But in the narrow domain, it is possible sometimes to get help from experts. And one thing that I sometimes do is this gets easier as you get on a bit, is to send your draft to 1 or 2 other people. Don't do this in a blunderbuss way. And a good approach is, I read your inspiring paper about this, and I've done some work that's based on it. And in fact, in my related work, I do discuss how the two fit together. And if you had a moment to glance at the related work section to see if I've described your work fairly, then that would be really great. And sometimes they think, I better look, and then they get hooked and they'll give you some feedback. Maybe. I wouldn't recommend this as a sort of default strategy a lot, but you may meet somebody at a conference that you think, oh, all right, maybe I've met them once, I could send them a draft. Getting good reviews from experts is hard. This is just one way that sometimes works. Yeah? Could they possibly just... Could they pinch your idea? Oh, they could pinch your idea, but it's terribly, terribly unlikely. So that's one of the lovely things about computer science. In biochemistry, say, the boundary of the subject is very clearly defined, and many research groups are right at the boundary, kind of competing with each other to see who will publish first. In computer science, it's like a snowflake, right? That everybody is working at their bit of the snowflake, and the snowflake is growing ahead of them, because we invent computer science. It's not like the natural world, right? It's sort of synthetic. So mostly, if I tell you what I'm working on, you think, well, that's cool, but it's not my part of the snowflake. Right? It's very rare to find somebody who's so much in your part of the snowflake that they would really want to steal your idea, even if they were wicked enough to do so. So generally speaking, it's not a problem. But it does tell you another thing, which is that in computer science, novelty is not enough, because novelty is too easy. The snowflake grows. You can always describe something that's new. Right? What's difficult is describing something that's new and useful. So don't just think for my paper, is it novel? Because that's not enough in computer science. It's enough in biochemistry. It's not enough in computer science. Should have had a slide about that. Last thing about feedback is how you receive feedback. So you've sent your paper to a conference or to a journal and it's come back rejected. Oh, and the reviews are just written by idiots. Right? They have no clue. They misunderstood everything. They don't appear to know their subject, and you're bleeding, right? Because these unfair reviewers have panned your paper and it got rejected. So first thing to do is just set it aside for several days, right, till you stop bleeding, and then go back to the reviews and think to yourself, how could I write the paper so that not even the stupidest reviewer could make that error? Okay? Then you'll get good value from your reviews. Occasionally, you will think, it cannot be clearer than it is. He's just an idiot. Right? But that is rare. Mostly reviewers are quite well qualified, and they certainly have devoted, for your paper, a quantity of their most precious resource, which is their time. Right? That is the one thing they cannot make more of. Unlike love, if I give Ben's paper half an hour of my time, I never have that half hour again. Right? So it's a precious resource that they're giving you. You should treat it with respect. Right? So don't tell them, even in your head, you stupid idiot, you should have understood it. Try to make it so they could not possibly misunderstand. Okay? So there you are. Those are the things I wanted to tell you. I've got in the slides, which I guess Scarlett will let you have. And there's a bit more about language and style and visual structure, but I didn't want to put that in the talk because we don't fit it in time. I want to sort of reprise the sort of seven ideas that I would like you to take away from this talk. This is an example, by the way, of what is the main idea. Well, this does have 7 main ideas, but the biggest idea is know what the idea is and convey it. Other questions and observations?
Trying to record that, by the
oh
way,
my!
Although you are
oh dear, yes. Poor Gary is moving his joystick rather vigorously. Yes.
This might be a non-native speaker problem, but I have the biggest trouble getting the tense right. And sometimes, so when I say, "Oh, they did this," and I thought, or we thought, this would be a good idea. Well, I still think it's a good idea. So, or we conducted a user study and 5 of them were female. Well, they are still female. So this jumping between past and present is what do you think about that?
I don't know that I can help you with a sort of simple answer now. What would I do? I would get hooked up with a native speaker, right, and sort of somehow say, would you be kind enough to look at this paragraph or even this paper and advise me? Because without quite a bit of context, I'm not a good enough teacher of English as a foreign language to know.
But do you write your papers in the present or more?
Oh, yes. Mostly I write in the present.
Okay.
Yes.
Even though
yes.
you still think it's a good idea.
Yeah. I'd need more context to.
Is it more engaging also to write in the present rather than to?
Well, certainly it's more engaging to write in the active voice, but I'm not quite sure about. I'm not quite sure about this present thing. Can you give me a concrete example again? Just one concrete example.
Well, if you think it's a good idea, or if you thought it was a good idea to do this back then when you had the idea,
yes,
you kind of like you're describing your research from a point of view when you had the idea, but you think it's a good idea.
But I wouldn't worry about the tense so much as about whether we want to say that at all, right? Because it's of no great interest to the reader what I think, right? So saying that's like telling them what I did in my summer holidays. You know, first I did this, and then I did that, and then I did the other. The reader doesn't care about that. They're interested so they're not really interested in what you think. So I suppose I'm stepping one step back and saying I wouldn't say that at all in any tense.
Okay, thanks.
So you think of another example over lunch, and we'll talk about it.
Yeah, I come from a different field from computer science, which is theoretical economics, and it has a different way of expressing ideas. But I'm doing a PhD in computer science, and I'm publishing in computer science conferences. So sometimes I think that the way that I used to express ideas in the other field is better than this one. So I explicitly choose this way. But when I give the draft to other computer scientists, one of the main critics I get is no, you should express this differently, even though I explicitly made this choice.
What was the choice that you made specifically?
Sorry?
What was the choice that you made?
Especially when you express these macro ideas, it's in theoretical economics. Usually, you get more philosophical before the maths, and which is I think is a better way of giving some abstraction of the idea. But this doesn't like. I mean, computer scientists don't like this a lot. But I still think it's better. But I also want to maximize the rate of acceptance of my paper. So sometimes I don't know what should I do. Should I change it or?
If you were talking to somebody on the whiteboard or in your office, would you start off with the philosophy?
Probably yes.
Okay, so just do what you do with your friend, I would say. But you probably wouldn't have a very long bit of philosophy. I don't know. I think sometimes there are cultural norms to which, in effect, you have to conform, because otherwise you'll have too much trouble with your referees. And I really can only speak to the cultural norms for computer science. And maybe you're butting up against that. But on the whole, I would start by thinking, what is the clearest, most engaging, most exciting way to present this idea to a fresh reader? And secondly, worry about whether that fits with the cultural norms, right? Which is not to say that maybe you, in the end, you have to give way on the norms, but start with what's engaging and exciting. If you start by thinking tactical questions about what you think people want to read, then there's a danger your whole paper will be put out of whack, and it turns out you were wrong about what they were expecting. Right? You see what I mean? So it's a dangerous place to start from these narrow tactical considerations. Yeah.
What do you think about the use of images and figures in papers? So I have the impression that having a picture on the first page, which also costs you some space for text, is actually a good idea if the picture ever actually says something or gives you an idea.
Yeah, so I mean, in general, and everybody will tell you this, pictures, diagrams, figures, all good, right? In my paper, I have a lot of figures because they contain reference material. You know, the API for a library, the typing judgments for something. So anything that somebody might want to refer back to, very good to put in a figure. Pictures of graphs or of diagrams of how things fit together. It certainly makes a paper much more engaging to read. Blocks of solid text, avoid as much as you can. Even if you can't think of a convenient use of pictures, use lots of subsections and bullets. I don't know about the page one thing. As you say, it takes a lot of column inches for a picture there. But if it's an insightful one, that somebody can look at the picture and get a real sense of what the paper's about, go for it.
I also just have a comment. When I wrote my PhD, my dissertation, there was an upper word limit for that you had. So you had to really squeeze down your ideas and digest them and just put in there what's really essential. Whereas, of course, if you don't have that, there is a danger that you put things in that are not really relevant. Is there any advice for paper writing?
Sure. So most conferences and indeed some journals have page limits or word limits.
Yes, but that you have perhaps, if you have only a small idea and then you kind of fill it up with things that are perhaps not really relevant for your main idea, but that you don't have enough content yet.
That's. I think the idea is too small. And you pad it out is vanishingly rare in my experience. Like I said, sometimes you have an idea, you write a paper about it, it turns out to be trivial. Then don't pad it out into a full-length paper, right? Obviously, just publish it on your website and move on. Much more common is you have an idea and you're struggling to fit it in the page limit. And you really have to think about, maybe there's a whole section I can export to an appendix or some way. But what you cannot do is to simply take a paper that really needs 20 pages and compress it to 12 by omitting every third word. This is not good, right? Because then you put off all your readers. Mm-hmm. You just have to find a way to say less, but say it comprehensibly. It was quite, right at the back, behind you, there was a guy in the check shirt, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So you mentioned that it's generally a bad idea. Thank you. So you mentioned that it's generally a bad idea to speak about dead ends, to speak about write about where you failed. On the other hand, I had a discussion recently that all over the world people waste lots of time because they don't know where other people failed in a similar or exactly the same area. So do you think it could be? Do you think that somehow people need a more or less formal way to share their failures, to share what doesn't work, so that they...
Oh, you're asking kind of about negative results.
Yeah, exactly.
So sometimes, that's right. So this is a difficult thing in science generally and in computer science. So negative results are important, right? Being able to report that something does not work is important, but it's very difficult to get it published. So it's really hard to write a paper that says, we tried X, Y, and Z and none of them worked, you should publish this paper. Right? Maybe particularly in computer science, because it's so synthetic, right? There's so much of the snowflake that's unproductive that reporting that, in biology, there might be a stronger reason, but it is hard publishing negative results, unless they're so obvious, like I was saying, that you think that really ought to work. Anybody would think that it would work. There's been 7 papers that have suggested that as a direction that should work, and it doesn't. In other words, there has to be a pretty compelling story to make a negative result publishable. And even then, it's better if you can also say, aha, but we fixed it. Right?
Thank you.
Okay, perhaps the last question, but Simon will be back after lunch, of course.
Yeah.
So, any more questions?
Great.
Otherwise,
I'm going to be, I'll be hanging around during lunch. So come and talk over lunch as well. Yeah, and post the session. Great. Good.
Thank you very much.
See you at lunch.